Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. It all began like a fairy tale for Sarah and her new husband, Ryan. They had met just a year ago, and everything between them felt like it was meant to be. Sarah was 27, with big dreams of a happy, peaceful life. She was friendly, outgoing, and always seemed to bring light into every room she entered. Ryan, on the other hand, was a little older and had a calm, confident way about him. He was successful, mysterious, and always knew the right things to say. Everyone who knew Ryan said he was ambitious and respected in his work, though nobody seemed to know exactly what that was. But Sarah didn't care. She was too swept up in her whirlwind romance to worry about the details. After their wedding, they moved into a beautiful, quiet neighborhood just outside the city. Their new house was cozy and picturesque, with small garden that Sarah looked forward to filling with flowers. The neighbors were friendly, always waving when they saw Sarah out in the yard, and she thought she'd finally found her place. It was the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs in the evening, and where everyone seemed to know each other. Sarah felt like she was living a dream of stability and love right beside her seemingly perfect husband. For the first few months, everything felt wonderful. Sarah admired Ryan's ambition and drive. He would often work late into the night, taking calls in his home office or typing away on his laptop. She'd sometimes tease him for being a workaholic, but he'd just smile, kiss her on the forehead, and assure her that it was all for their future. Sarah couldn't help but admire his dedication. In her eyes, Ryan was her prince, the kind of man who would work hard to give them both a good life. But over time, Sarah began to notice small, strange things. They weren't big enough to make her worry, but just odd. For instance, Ryan always had a separate phone he kept tucked away in his pocket, and he'd never let her see it. When Sarah would ask about it, he'd say it was just business. There was also the way he'd suddenly leave the room to take calls, his voice dropping to a whisper when he thought she couldn't hear. Sometimes he'd be so absorbed in his work that he wouldn't even notice her standing right outside his office door watching him. He always seemed to be hiding something on his screen, quickly closing his laptop. When she walked in one evening, while Sarah was tidying up, she found an old, slightly worn-out notebook hidden between a stack of his papers. Curious, she opened it and skimmed the pages, but before she could read more than a few lines, Ryan appeared behind her, grabbing the notebook and snapping it shut. His reaction startled her. He'd never been angry with her before, but his face softened as quickly as it had hardened. He laughed it off, saying it was just old business notes, but there was something in his eyes that Sarah couldn't quite read. Still, she tried to ignore these moments. Ryan was her husband. After all, she trusted him. Everyone had secrets, she told herself, and Ryan was probably just stressed about work. Yet as the weeks went by, Sarah found herself noticing more and more peculiar things. Ryan would come home sometimes with small injuries, a scrape here, a bruise there. He'd always have an excuse ready, saying he'd slipped at work or gotten a bit too rough at the gym. Sarah tried to believe him, but doubt was creeping in. She started to feel more on edge. A few times, Sarah thought she saw Ryan walking down the street late at night, even though he told her he was working late at the office. One night, she decided to follow him quietly. She saw him meeting someone in a dark car, the two of them talking in low voices before Ryan hurried back inside. Sarah hurried back to bed, pretending to be asleep. When he came in a few minutes later, her mind raced with questions. Who was Ryan meeting so late at night? Why did he have another phone? Why did he seem so guarded about his past, despite her growing unease? Sarah tried to push the doubts away, thinking she was being silly. She reminded herself of the Ryan she loved, the one who made her laugh and always took care of her. But soon even the neighbors started noticing things. One morning, Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, mentioned that she'd seen Ryan talking to a stranger in a parked car a few blocks away. Sarah laughed it off, saying it must have been work-related, but she felt her cheeks burning. Mrs. Thompson's eyes lingered on her, full of sympathy, as if she knew Sarah was lying to herself with each passing day. Sarah felt her perfect life slipping just a little further out of reach. She wanted to believe Ryan was exactly who he said he was, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Even the little things around the house felt different now, the way his cologne seemed stronger or how he left things just slightly out of place. She knew it sounded silly, but it was like the man she married was slowly becoming a stranger, and yet she kept trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was overthinking everything, but deep down she knew her life was about to change, in ways she could have never imagined as days turned into weeks. Sarah found herself noticing more things that just didn't make sense. It all started one Saturday afternoon when she was cleaning up the house while Ryan was out. She was organizing a drawer in his office when she found a small folder tucked away at the back. It looked like something Ryan had tried to hide buried under a pile of papers she'd never seen him use. Curiosity got the best of her and she pulled it out. Inside, Jenna found several documents that made her freeze. There were some official-looking papers with words she didn't understand and a passport she had never seen before, but what shocked her most was that the passport wasn't under Ryan's name. Instead of Ryan Miller, the name she knew so well, it read Ethan Mallister. Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the unfamiliar name and the photo that clearly showed her husband's face, who was Ethan. Why would Ryan have a second passport with a different name? She quickly put everything back, her mind racing. Could it be some kind of mistake? Maybe it was just an old document from before they met, but deep down she knew that didn't make sense. If it was just an old passport, why hide it? When Ryan came home later that day, Sarah tried to act normal, but every word he spoke felt strange, like he was someone else entirely. For the first time, she found herself wondering who exactly had she married over the next few days. Sarah kept a closer eye on him. She noticed how he seemed more secretive than ever, taking phone calls in hushed tones and often stepping outside so she wouldn't overhear. One night when she heard his voice through the open window, she carefully slipped over and listened. His words were tense and clipped, filled with things she didn't understand, like arrangements, the deal, and everything's under control. The more she listened, the more she felt her heart drop. This wasn't the man she thought she knew. One evening she decided she couldn't hold back anymore and asked him about his work, trying to sound casual. She wanted to see if he opened up or mention anything about what she'd overheard. But Ryan just brushed her questions off, saying he didn't want to bore her with the details. Normally, Sarah would have dropped it there, but not. This time she gently pushed a bit more, asking if everything was okay, and his answer was quick and almost defensive. Of course, he said, his tone sharper than usual. Why wouldn't it be? After that, Sarah knew something was definitely wrong. She felt torn, confused, and a little scared. She loved Ryan, but how could she trust him if he was hiding things from her? That night, lying in bed beside him, she felt an ache in her heart. She wanted to believe he was the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who made her feel safe. But now she wasn't so sure. Days passed and Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. It felt like her world was slowly unraveling. She started noticing other small details, like how Ryan had certain habits she'd never seen before: locking his office door when he wasn't home quickly, switching off his computer screen whenever she entered the room, and glancing over his shoulder more often than usual. One morning, while Ryan was out again, Sarah decided to dig a little deeper. She went back to his office and found the same folder, heart pounding as she carefully opened it. Again, she took her time this time, looking through every paper. There were legal documents with strange terms, business names she didn't recognize, and even a few letters signed by different people. One of them had the name Ethan Mallister scribbled at the bottom, confirming that the passport wasn't a mistake. Whoever Ethan was, Ryan seemed deeply connected to him. Or maybe he was him. Just as Sarah was about to put the papers back, her eye caught something else: a small worn notebook buried under the rest of the documents. She flipped it, a pen, and found pages filled with numbers, addresses, and what looked like codes. The writing was neat but unreadable to her, making her feel even more on edge when she heard Ryan's car pull into the driveway. She quickly closed the notebook, shoved everything back into the drawer, and rushed out of the room. Her heart was pounding, but she knew she had to act like nothing had happened. She didn't want Ryan to know that she was beginning to uncover his secrets later. That night, Sarah lay awake, her mind spinning. The man lying next to her, the man she had trusted with her life, seemed to have a completely different identity. She felt torn in half. One part of her wanted to confront him right then and there, while the other part was too afraid of what she might find out. She didn't want to believe that Ryan, the person who had promised to love her, could be hiding such a big part of himself. In the following days, Sarah struggled with her emotions. She would look at Ryan, hoping to see a glimpse of the man she thought she knew, but all she saw were the shadows, the secrets he carried that now haunted her too. Sometimes she wanted to ignore everything, to pretend It was just her imagination, but each time she remembered that second passport or the strange notebook, she knew that wasn't possible. Every time Ryan left the house, Sarah felt herself slipping further away from the life she thought she had. She was still in love with him, or at least Thiemann, she believed him to be, but fear and mistrust were starting to creep, and she could sense herself on the edge of a decision she wasn't ready to make, one that could change her life forever. With every passing day, Sarah felt herself drawn deeper into a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. The love she once felt now felt tangled in knots of suspicion, and the future she had once dreamed of now looked uncertain and dark. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to take a turn, and that the man she had trusted with her heart must be leading her into something she never expected by now. Sarah felt like a stranger in her own life. The man she had married, the person she trusted more than anyone, was hiding a side of himself that terrified her. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. She had to confront Ryan and demand the truth. So one evening while Ryan was out, she sat on the couch, heart pounding, waiting for him to come home. She knew that once he walked through the door, everything would change. When Ryan finally stepped inside, he noticed her sitting there staring at him with an intensity she'd never shown before. He looked surprised, but he put on a smile, trying to keep things casual. "Hey, is everything okay?" he asked, setting his keys down on the table. But Sarah wasn't going to fall for that calm, reassuring voice he always used. "No, Ryan, everything is not okay," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and danger. "I need to know the truth. Who are you? And don't say Ryan, because I know there's more to the story." Ryan's face went blank for a moment. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable, but Sarah pressed on. "I found the passport. I saw the name Ethan Mallister. I heard you talking on the phone about deals and arrangements." She felt her hands start to shake, but clenched them tight, refusing to back down. "I need to know who I married, Ryan, or is it Ethan?" At first, Ryan tried to laugh it off, acting like she was just being paranoid. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous," he said, a forced smile on his face. But as she stared him down, unflinching, his smile faded. He seemed to realize she wasn't going to let it go. This time his shoulders slumped, and for the first time Sarah saw a flash of something in his eyes. "Fear, fine," he said, his voice low and serious. "You want the truth. The truth is, I haven't been completely honest with you." Sarah felt her stomach twist as she waited, holding her breath. Ryan looked away, his gaze settling on the wall, as if he couldn't bear to meet her eyes. "Before we met wasn't exactly on the right side of the law." Sarah's heart pounded as she listened. He continued, his words coming out slowly, like he was choosing each one carefully. "I used to be involved in certain deals, business that wasn't exactly clean, but that's all behind me now," he added quickly, his tone almost desperate. "I left that life before I met you, Sarah. I swear I did." But Sarah's mind was spinning. Crime deals, the man she loved, the man she thought she knew, wasteling her. He used to be a criminal. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. How could you keep this from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back, her eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. "Sarah, I didn't want to lie to you," he said, sounding almost pleading. I thought it was all in the past. I thought if I told you, you'd leave, and I couldn't bear to lose you." Sarah shook her head, anger bubbling up inside her. "So, you just decided to hide it from me? To lie to me every single day? I trusted you, Ryan. I trusted you with everything." Her voice grew louder, the hurt pouring out of her. "And all this time you've been living a lie." Ryan's expression hardened. "I didn't lie about loving you, Sarah," he said, his voice sharp. "Everything I did was to protect you, protect me." Sarah snapped. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. You were protecting your secrets." Her voice was shaking now, and she could feel tears in her eyes. She wanted to believe he had changed, that he was the man she had fallen in love with, but how could she, when he had kept something so big from her? Ryan clenched his fists, his face darkening. "I did what I had to do, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "You don't understand? You've never been in my shoes. Then maybe I don't want to understand." Sarah replied, her own anger matching his. Because the man I married would have trusted me enough to tell the truth. I don't know who you are anymore." She turned away, her heart aching, feeling as though everything she'd believed in was crumbling. Suddenly Ryan reached out, grabbing her arm, and his grip was stronger than she'd ever felt. "Don't walk away from me, Sarah," he said, his voice low, but filled with anger. Sarah's heart raced as she looked into his eyes, which were colder than she'd ever seen. "Let go of me, Ryan," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice, but he didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened and a flash of frustration and rage crossed his face. Sarah could see the tension in his jaw, the anger boiling just below the surface. "After everything I've done for you," he muttered, his voice rising, "you think you can just walk out on me?" Sarah struggled, trying to pull her arm free, but Ryan held on, his face twisted with emotions. She didn't recognize Ryan. "Please?" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "You're hurting me." For a moment, Ryan just stared at her, his eyes full of something dark and terrifying. Then, as if realizing what he was doing, he let go, stumbling back a few steps. Sarah watched him, heart pounding, not sure whether to run or stay frozen. Ryan's face softened and he looked almost regretful. "Sarah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," he started, but Sarah was already backing away, shaking her head. Without another word, Sarah turned and rushed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure: the man she had once trusted with her whole heart was not who she thought he was. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, her heart still racing from the argument with Ryan. She couldn't shake the cold look he'd given her. It was a sight of him she had never seen, and it made her feel like she was standing next to a stranger. Just as she was about to reach for her phone to call her best friend, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and there was Ryan, his face shadowed and unreadable for amament. They just stared at each other, the silence thick and heavy. Then, without warning, Ryan's expression changed. It was like a switch had flipped inside him, and his face twisted with anger. "Are you really going to ruin everything over this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Sarah backed up, her mind racing with fear. "Ryan, please," she whispered, hoping to calm him down. I just need some time to think." But Ryan didn't seem to hear her. His hands balled into fists and he stepped closer, his eyes cold and hard. "You don't get to just walk away," he said, his voice shaking with anger. Sarah felt trapped, her back pressed against the counter with nowhere to go. In a flash of movement, Ryan reached out, grabbing her shoulders roughly. Sarah tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. She felt his fingers dig into her arms and the pain made her cry out, "Ryan, stop." She screamed, hoping the neighbors might hear, but he didn't let go. The anger in his eyes was terrifying, and Sarah could see he was no longer the man she thought she knew. She tried to reason with him, her voice shaky and desperate. "Ryan, please, we can talk about this. Just let me go." But her words only seemed to make him angrier, with a yell of frustration. Ryan shoved her back and Sarah felt herself stumble. Her head hitting the edge of the counter, stars exploded in her vision, and she felt a sharp throbbing pain as she crumpled to the floor, her vision blurry and darkening. The next moments were a haze of confusion and pain. Sarah could hear Ryan muttering something, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. She tried to move, to reach out for help, but her body felt heavy and numb. She couldn't make sense of what was happening, only that she was in danger and that she needed to get away. At some point, the world around her went completely silent and she drifted into darkness. It was only later, as sirens blared and red and blue lights flashed through the neighborhood, that the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. A neighbor, hearing Sarah's screams, had called 911, and within minutes the police and an ambulance had arrived, filling the quiet street with chaos. The officers rushed into the house, following the sound of Ryan's footsteps as he tried to escape, but they quickly found him standing in the hallway, dazed and shaken. He was covered in blood, his face pale and expressionless. It was as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just done. Meanwhile, paramedics attended to Sarah, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. She was barely conscious, her face pale and bruised, her breathing shallow. The neighbors gathered outside, whispering in shock and disbelief as they watched the scene unfold. Just hours earlier, they had seen Ryan and Sarah as the perfect happy couple. Now they could hardly believe the horror that had taken place right next door. Sarah's closest friend, who lived down the street, watched with tears in her eyes as the ambulance doors closed and sped off, carrying Sarah to the hospital. She could hardly process what she was seeing: her best friend, the happiest person she knew, now fighting for her life. And Ryan, the man they had all admired, was now being led out of the house in handcuffs, his face blank and his hands stained with blood. News of the incident spread quickly through the town, and soon everyone was talking about it. People who had once looked up to Ryan, admiring his success and his charm, were now horrified by the reality that had been hiding beneath his perfect facade. They had never guessed that such darkness lurked inside him. The once peaceful neighborhood was now buzzing with reporters, police cars, and curious onlookers, all trying to make sense of the tragedy that had shattered their quiet street friends. And neighbors who'd once welcomed Sarah and Ryan into their homes were now shaken, wondering how they could have missed the signs. They whispered among themselves, replaying moments they'd shared with the couple, wondering if there had ever been clues to the truth. Days later, as Sarah lay in a hospital bed recovering from her injuries, she was surrounded by friends and family who couldn't stop asking questions. They wanted to know how it had all gone so wrong, how the man they had all trusted could turn violent. But Sarah had no answers for them. She was still coming to terms with the nightmare. She had survived piecing together the memories of that terrible night. As for Ryan, his life as he knew it was over. The police investigation revealed more secrets about his past, and soon his reputation was destroyed. People who had once respected him now looked at him with disgust and horror, unable to comprehend how he had hidden so much for so long. The community, once proud to have such an upstanding couple in their midst, was left with a deep scar. The peaceful, friendly neighborhood would never be the same for years to come. People would speak in hushed tones about what had happened there, warning each other that things aren't always what they seem, and that even the most perfect lives can hide dark secrets. Sarah would never fully recover from the trauma of that night. She knew that the life she had once dreamed of was gone forever, replaced by a new reality, one filled with fear, pain, and unanswered questions. But she was grateful to be alive, even if the scars of that night would stay with her forever. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but was determined. Tove in peace, one step at a time. The day of Ryan's trial arrived with a somber gray sky, as if even the weather knew the gravity of what was about to unfold. News of the attack had spread far and wide, and the quiet neighborhood that once admired Ryan and Sarah was now filled with whispers of betrayal and tragedy. People who had once looked up to Ryan, who thought of him as a friend and role model, were now forced to see him in a new and terrifying light. The courtroom was packed. Sarah sat in the front row, looking pale and thin from the week she'd spent recovering in the hospital. The bruises had faded, but the pain was still there, hidden behind her eyes. She avoided looking at Ryan, who sat across the room with his lawyer, his face a mix of anger and shame. This was the man she had once loved, but now he was nothing more than a stranger to her. The prosecutor began the case by laying out everything Ryan had done, not just the attack on Sarah, but his entire history. Evidence had surfaced about Ryan's past, revealing connections to crimes and shady business deals that shocked everyone in the room. It was hard to believe that the man who had once been respected by everyone was involved in such a dark world. Some people gasped as they listened, horrified by what they were hearing. They whispered to each other, wondering how they could have missed the signs, how they had let someone so dangerous live among them. As the trial continued, one witness after another took the stand. Friends, neighbors, and even Sarah's family members spoke, their voices filled with sadness and disbelief. They shared stories about Ryan, recalling little signs that now seemed like warning flags. One neighbor remembered seeing him argue with Sarah in their backyard, his voice raised in anger, while she looked frightened and small. Another friend recalled how Ryan was always secretive about his job, giving vague answers whenever someone asked what he did for a living. But the testimonies weren't just about Ryan's dark side. Some neighbors, especially Theonies, who had only known him casually, still struggled to believe he was capable of such violence. They remembered him as a charming, helpful man, always willing to lend a hand or share a laugh. It was as if there were two different versions of Ryan, and the community was left wondering which one was real. Sarah took the stand as well, her voice shaking as she relived the events of that terrible night. She spoke about the anger in Ryan's eyes, the way his voice had turned cold and threatening tears ran down her face as she described the moment he had grabbed her, how helpless and terrified she had felt. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.